Welcome to this course on Secondary Data Review and Analysis from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Lesson 2, Humanitarian Needs Analysis 1. In this lesson we will look closer at humanitarian needs analysis. We will define what it is and talk about the different steps of needs analysis, what they are, and the potential outputs you can get from them. Lastly, we will discuss joint analysis and how it ties to the steps of analysis. Humanitarian needs analysis. So let us first start talking about what humanitarian needs analysis is. It is the process of interpreting available information to identify significant facts, trends, and anomalies to inform decision-making. Analysis has traditionally not been a well-established discipline in the humanitarian sector. It has tended to be aimed at technical, computer-based skills, focusing mainly on database analysis and use of various data analysis software. Conducting analysis, however, involves far more than collecting information and manipulating software. Analysis is a human process that requires the application of cognitive functions, the use of targeted analytical approaches, and an inquisitive mindset. Being an analyst does not necessarily require any particular qualifications apart from a critical mindset and common sense. Essentially, it involves looking at the information available and trying to tell a story. What has happened? What is happening now? What is important and why? What don't we know? What might happen next? In many disaster situations, there is simply more information, misinformation, and background noise than anyone can handle. The information available is often of varying quality, coverage, timeliness, and accuracy, challenging the ability to make sense of it. To stay on track and navigate the maze of biases and other distractions, our mental processes require a structure to help us to think slowly while having to act fast. Some simple tools, methods, and approaches can help turn data into meaningful information. Analysis steps. Let's look at one approach of understanding analysis and dive a bit deeper into how we do it. We do not arrive magically from having data to giving an analysis. There are several steps in analysis that will guide us through the process and help us move from the data itself to making sense of what they actually mean. On the left-hand side, you will see the time scale. Oftentimes, at the beginning of an emergency, the analysis is reactive, as you will have limited time to produce and deliver. As time spent increases, the analysis will be deeper and more forward-looking, focused into future consequences. On the thought process axis, you will see that first it will be about what the data is telling you immediately. Later on, it will be more thinking about concepts and getting more out of the data that exists. If this is true, then what else could be true? The first step in analysis is what we call descriptive analysis. It is the same as reporting and is what is usually done in the very first hours and days of a sudden onset disaster, when we report on what data we have and try to structure it as well as possible. In this step, we summarize and compare information. Descriptive analysis. Let's have a closer look at this. This is where we summarize what is known about situations, people, places, or objects. It identifies what is valid or worth noting about who, what, when, where, and how. The data should be organized in a way that is easy to comprehend and recall. The key here is to summarize the data and compare the results. How comparisons are structured depends on the context, but it is good practice to compare impact across geographic locations or humanitarian sectors using visuals, maps, and other infographics if possible. Comparisons with pre-crisis data are also vital to highlight changes and/or long-standing issues that have been exacerbated by the impact of the disaster. For example, we can compare the situation for IDPs in camps versus IDPs residing in public buildings or makeshift shelters. Or we can compare women versus men or children versus adults. Another comparison can be how geographical areas have been affected. What areas have suffered most damage to houses following an earthquake, or how many are in need of humanitarian assistance in one area versus another. These summarizations and comparisons are often visualized as infographics or put on a map, making it easy for our audience to get an overview. Describe, output. Here is an example of descriptive analysis. You see only a dashboard and a map with lots of data points and short descriptions of the situations a few weeks after the earthquake in Nepal 2015. There is no explanation or interpretation of data. Look at the infographic showing number of deaths in the top right-hand corner. There is nothing to explain why one district has more deaths than neighbouring districts, even if they are equally far away from the epicenter. So, you have taken data and described what you see. However, any further explanation or interpretation is up to the reader. This is similar to reporting, but we want to dig deeper and find answers to the questions a report like this triggers. Descriptive situation analysis. A big part of descriptive analysis is to create a good situational analysis that forms the basis for further steps. It is broad in scope and entails both the needs analysis and an analysis of the operational context. The output will often be a combination of visuals and narratives, and even if mostly descriptive, it can move into further steps of analysis if there is room for that. It should focus on, but not be limited to, the following topics: the pre-crisis vulnerability, the humanitarian profile, the operational constraints, the scope and scale of a crisis, the humanitarian conditions as a result, and the capacities and response in a crisis. The paradox is that both this situation analysis report, as well as the dashboard shown on the previous slide, require a lot of resources to make, like specialized software, advanced information management skills, and many work hours to create. But the products do not always tell us why the situation is as it is or what it means. What program should I launch? What is most important, and why? Analysis steps. Thus, we have to go further in our analysis. The second step is referred to as explanatory analysis. Here we identify relationships, correlations, causes, and effects. Explanatory analysis probes the reason or immediate causes of a situation, explaining why a situation has developed in the way described. This sort of reasoning should be included in reports to explain why a situation has developed as it has. It is about providing context to the results and pointing out possible causes for a particular problem. Explanatory analysis. Let's have a closer look at this. When we do explanatory analysis, we are first and foremost trying to answer the questions of why things are like they are. What we're looking for are associations and correlations that may suggest a cause and effect relationship. We use the word suggest deliberately here because in emergencies we can rarely provide scientific evidence of what has caused something. We can only study how things are associated and look at how strong the correlation between the associations are. With association, we mean correspondence, connection or link between two or more pieces of data whose dependence can be presumed, measured, or even verified. Are some observations connected? When something changes, what else changes? With correlation, we mean the degree to which an association of data tends to follow a certain pattern. Do we see a strong or weak correlation between combinations? Explain. Let's look at an example of explanatory analysis using a problem tree. This will help identify root causes of a problem and make qualified assumptions about possible consequences if the situation goes unaddressed. It will also support decisions about type of responses, both emergency interventions and others addressing the root causes. Staying in the example of the 2015 Nepal earthquake, let's say you have an outbreak of cholera in one location. This is not uncommon after a natural disaster, with damages to infrastructure in a country where cholera is endemic. But you still need to be specific about the reasons why, as it may help you design targeted responses later. First, you brainstorm possible causes and you can dig even deeper by exploring possible root causes for what has caused the outbreak. This usually requires bringing in contextual knowledge, but will be essential to determine interventions for longer-term solutions. Once we have the causes mapped out, we can look to potential consequences of the outbreaks, which will guide emergency interventions. The cholera outbreak is the focal problem, which we can describe in the first level of analysis. Explaining it by presenting both causes and effects makes the analysis better and more thorough. Assessment Report Briefing Note. When looking for associations and how they correlate, we get closer to answer the why question and provide context to the results. Basically, we point out how some presumed intermediate causes for a particular problem and show how various findings can be correlated. Let's look at this example related to education. We know that children are not attending school, IDPs are sheltering in schools. We also know that there are high levels of food insecurity in the same areas. An explanation of this could be, even if families want their children to return to school, and even if teachers are available and children can access the school building, they will not be able to resume classes unless some action is taken to address the living arrangements of the IDPs currently residing in the school and remedy any damage to school buildings, facilities and learning materials. However, even when the connection appears obvious, as in example 1, it is important to be explicit. Another explanation can be this. In a rural area where people are largely dependent on their own crops for food and livelihoods, and known to be food insecure, children may be needed to assist in agricultural activities in the wake of a crisis, thus keeping them away from school. Exercise. Let's try this for ourselves. Look at these 4 snippets of data and see if you can connect the dots and make a coherent paragraph out of them. Approximately 20 cases of cholera have been detected in Alpha City. Alpha City has 1 hospital with inpatient capacity and 2 health clinics for outpatient treatment. The recent rain has led to several flash floods in Alpha City. Population of Alpha City, 564,000, 2011 census. Just take a pen and paper and use 4 minutes to note down a suggestion for yourself. One way to look at it is to suggest a link between flash floods, contaminated water, and the outbreak of cholera. Please note that we're not claiming there is a proven cause and effect here, but merely suggesting an association and saying that it is highly likely that there is a connection. Here's another one. Please take 5 minutes and see what you can make out of this one. High incidence of respiratory disease is recorded by mobile health teams amongst IDPs residing along the road to Kabul. Intense fighting between Taliban and Afghan armed forces broke out in Charikar, 70 kilometers north of Kabul. 178,323 IDPs. An estimated 180,000 IDPs became displaced after intense conflicts in Sharikar, Afghanistan, between the Afghan armed forces and the Taliban. The IDPs left their homes and set up makeshift camps on the road towards Kabul. By mid-November, temperatures at night were as low as -2 degrees Celsius. With poor makeshift shelters, a lack of resources and livelihoods due to displacement, including a lack of heating supplies, respiratory diseases have increased. Please note how we have rounded the figure of IDPs, as the original figure suggests a level of precision that would have been impossible without registration or counting. We have also made some assumptions about temperatures being low due to the time of year and climate in the area. We are also assuming that the IDPs are living in substandard shelters and that here is a connection between that and respiratory infections. We have no evidence of these connections, but they are likely and plausible. Bear in mind that explanatory analysis in emergencies is not about presenting explicit evidence that would hold up in a court of law. We need to accept a level of uncertainty here and come up with explanations that are logical, plausible, and likely. In other words, explanations that are good enough and make it possible to plan immediate, life-saving responses. Assumptions. As we saw in the last examples, we will need to fill information gaps with assumptions. They can be a slippery slope, though, and you need to keep track of which is data and what is an assumption. To keep track of the assumptions you use, it is recommended to note them down on a separate checklist so you can always go back and show what is based on data and what is based on assumptions. You should also develop alternative hypotheses to challenge your own views and ways of thinking. Or, even better, have someone else come up with alternative explanations. Several minds think better than one, and at this stage of the analysis process, it is highly recommended that you discuss the explanations with colleagues and peers, and this is the transition point between explanatory and the next step we are going to talk about, interpretive analysis. Analysis steps. The next step, we just mentioned it, is interpretive analysis. This step gives meaning to the initial findings, identifies priorities, and tells the audience what is most important and why it is important. This implies going beyond just explaining the information, but also reaching a conclusion. Of all the information available, what is important and why it must be explained. Asking the question, what does it mean? Interpretation examines the significance of a problem or topic of interest as it relates to the decision-maker's interests, using logic to interpret and make judgments about the situation. Interpreting information involves using all information available to make sure that it is a plausible interpretation and not just an opinion. At this stage in the analysis process, it is imperative to bring in peers, colleagues and partners to discuss the findings and agree on what they mean. Decision-makers' willingness to accept an interpretation is closely connected to their ability to see its plausibility and the level of expert agreement. An interpretation is not a fact, but a theory. Often, the best an analyst can hope for with their explanations is not that others will say, "Yes, that is obviously right," but rather, "Yes, I can see why it might be possible and reasonable to think as you do." An analyst needs to decide what possible interpretation best accounts for what they think is the most important and most interesting to notice about the findings given the context. This may include evaluating the nature of a situation, asking whether it is a severe humanitarian crisis. Or it may include the extent of a problem, whether it is a major food security crisis, for example. Or it may include the significance of a situation, whether decision makers need to pay attention now rather than next year. Interpret. When we interpret data, we often do that in a group setting, as multiple brains work better than one. In humanitarian emergencies, incomplete data sets, uncertainty and disagreements about priorities are the rule rather than the exemption. Shared analysis is where you balance lack of evidence with high agreements among analysts. It is the best we can do to move forward with an appropriate response. When we have limited or medium evidence of a problem, we can, through discussion, using our collective wisdom, balance it out by agreeing on what the observations we do have actually mean. This is where we discuss the data, both verifying their meaning, but also prioritizing what, among all the results we have, we need to warn about and why. This can, of course, be very difficult, but it is a useful exercise. For example, if everything is described as urgent or important, then nothing is, and only by putting our brains together and use our collective smartness can we make heads and tails out of what we have in front of us. Going back to the earthquake in Nepal, this is an example of a product that determined the severity of humanitarian needs per geographic area by adding up various measures like vulnerability, population figures and earthquake impact, and discussing how these measures together would impact a conclusion on severity. The evidence was semi-robust but not conclusive in itself. However, through a discussion between subject matter experts and people with local knowledge, you could reach a conclusion as to what area had more severe humanitarian needs than others. Interpret. What is important? There's no formula or recipe for deciding what is most important in an emergency, but we do have some guiding principles that can help us reach an agreement as to what issues require most attention first. In the amount of secondary data we process, we also find a lot of noise, meaning a lot of information that is neither important or useful and just serves to confound the matter at hand. What we need to do first is to separate the signal from the noise, meaning we need to focus on issues that are more severe than others. Deciding on severity using secondary data, however, can be a very subjective exercise, and most probably it will be different from context to context and emergency to emergency. A somewhat simple model to decide on what is important to report on can be described by looking at how informative and new the information is. Is it concrete? Is it new? And is it clear? From all the explanations we have found, are these the ones where associations and correlations are strongest? Does this directly inform our decisions? How much does it matter? Does the issue go beyond a threshold of acceptability or below minimum standards for humanitarian conditions? For example, if we use sphere standards as a criteria, does this issue not meet these standards? How urgently does this deserve a response in order to avoid a serious deterioration? For example, if we do not respond now, will more people die, be made homeless, or experience increased suffering and worsening of their well-being? All of this together helps us define the severity of the conditions being reported and what issues matter more than others. What issues cause more harm or have more undesirable effects than others? This, however, is contextual and needs to be addressed on a case-to-case basis. What are priorities? We know in the humanitarian sector that we do not have all the available financial and human resources, time and other factors to respond to each and every need. Therefore, we will have to prioritize what we respond to. Once we understand the severity of an issue, it will help us to prioritize. The most severe humanitarian needs and issues will become priorities. In terms of priorities, we distinguish between three types: priority sector and intersector priorities. Often, it will not be possible to say that one sector is more important than another. But we should be able to argue why certain issues within a sector and how they link together should be prioritized over other interventions. We cannot say just WASH is a priority, for example, but have to specify what issues within WASH need to be focused on first, how they influence, for example, health issues, and argue our case. Priority geographical area. What areas, regions, districts, etc. should be higher prioritised than others, and why? Often the argument for geographical priorities can be arrived at by agreeing on the number of affected, which is sometimes easy to grasp and agree with, meaning the area with the most people in need should be helped first. Priority affected groups, for example IDPs, refugees, etc. Here we often need to bring in secondary data on pre-existing vulnerabilities in addition to findings on who is most at risk. In humanitarian response operations, we have incomplete data, uncertainty, time pressure, and disagreement on priorities. Usually, this is the default setting. More often than not, we will not have all the pieces of the puzzle and will have to argue for why one issue should be prioritised before another. Remember from Lesson 1 that decision makers' willingness to accept our interpretation of what should be prioritised is closely connected to their ability to see its plausibility and the level of expert agreement. Often, the best we can hope for is not that others will say, yes, this is obviously right, but rather, yes, I do see why it might be possible and reasonable to think as you do. Analysis steps. The next step is where we try to look beyond the curve that involves comparing the pre-crisis situation to the present situation and trying to consider how the situation will evolve over time based on different types and levels of response and other potential developments. We call this anticipatory analysis, and this is the final step in the analysis process, where potential scenarios are developed and we ask, what if? What will happen if decision makers do not pay attention now? What will happen if the situation goes unaddressed? As an analyst, you should always look to the future, asking what might happen next and proactively anticipate what course a situation may take. This is generally based on lessons learned from previous emergencies, the analyst's experience, knowledge and strategies for modelling evidence and forecasting possible outcomes for a given initial situation. Anticipatory analysis may also lead to contingency planning, especially if the developments envisaged are dependent on certain assumptions about what may happen next. For example, an upcoming monsoon season or other climatic events that occur annually and may exacerbate the humanitarian needs. Analysts should be proactive in engaging key stakeholders in anticipatory analysis, prompting discussions by asking questions like, what will the situation look like in 6 months? Or, what will happen with the displaced population if heavy rainfall should occur? Questions like this can be very useful and will help program planning. Anticipate. For example, when doing anticipatory analysis for education following the Nepal earthquake, we would ask such questions as, what will the consequences be if decision makers decide to focus on rebuilding schools without prioritising temporary emergency education services in the rebuilding period? This forces several other questions. How long is the rebuilding period likely to take? Will this mean that a large number of children have been out of school for so long that they are not likely to return? How will livelihoods of teachers be impacted during this time? How will the upcoming monsoon season affect reconstruction work and the situation for children in general? Will teachers be available once reconstruction is complete? This form of anticipatory analysis should be included when making more strategic response planning. Like in this case, when it was deemed plausible and highly likely that reconstruction would take so long that children would be at risk of trafficking and child labour in the interim phase, and emergency education services should be a priority. Analysis steps. Lastly, it is important to note that the first steps described here are easily done individually. However, the deeper the analysis goes, the more it is preferably done by multiple people. Several brains think better than one, and at the end of the day, the human brain is the best analytical tool we have. Joint analysis. Discussing what is most severe and most important can be a demanding and painful affair, but it is essential to discuss and endeavour to reach an agreement in as far as possible. Joint analysis is powerful, and it is something that can be easily implemented within an organisation or between several organisations. A joint analysis can come in many forms and range from just a couple of people discussing the data to a larger, cluster sector-wide, workshops involving partners from many organisations, representatives from people of concern, governments, etc., all representing a variety of viewpoints. It may resemble just another meeting, but really isn't. Let's look at a couple of characteristics. A joint analysis session intends to establish a common understanding of the situation by agreeing on the findings. Compensate lack of evidence with expert judgment. Resolve inconsistencies in the data through discussion and information sharing. Agree on priorities and the way forward. Develop likely scenarios for how the situation may evolve. Let's look at this in more detail. Firstly, joint analysis is a facilitated analysis process between different stakeholders where the facilitator's role is key to a successful outcome. It can take many forms, from huge 2-day workshops to Skype calls between close colleagues. The form is not important, but the focus and outcome is. It is an opportunity to discuss the data, information, clarifying what it means and prioritising what, among all the results we have, we need to focus on and why. This can, of course, be very difficult, but it is a useful exercise. For example, if everything is described as urgent or important, then nothing is, and only by putting our brains together and using our collective smartness can we make heads and tails out of what we have in front of us. This is where we do interpretive analysis, which is another one of the distinctive features that separates us from just another meeting. If participants in a shared analysis meeting turn up not knowing the data and is there to be informed and share their own information, the analysis process will be stalled. You might as well call it off and postpone it until everyone has had the chance to become informed. One of the huge advantages is that we can compensate a lack of hard facts with agreements. This is a variation of the Delphi method, which is a method based on the principle that decisions from a structured group of individuals are more accurate than those from unstructured groups. It is used as a method to mitigate biases and reach more reasoned decisions. Added value. So why do we do this joint analysis together, even though it is a long process? Different viewpoints from different sectors and different areas of expertise are needed to fully understand the picture. We all carry biases from our personalities, professions and organisations. We can mitigate this by working together. Two minds think better than one. One person will not interpret and conclude something and also be accurate. It is easier to create situational awareness when looking at data with multiple people. If we reach some agreement on what the data means and we represent different viewpoints and interests, the outcome becomes owned by everyone. And if you can go to decision makers saying that we all agree that this is what the findings mean and can show that you have taken the data through a thorough process, the final outcome will carry considerable strength. Joint analysis, where you balance lack of evidence with high agreements, is the best we can do to move forward with an appropriate response. When we have limited or medium evidence of a problem, we can, through discussion, using our collective wisdom, balance it out by agreeing on what the observations we do have actually mean. Joint analysis process. Like everything, joint analysis also has its own process. The first 3 steps are done in preparation of a joint analysis session. The other 3 steps are done in the joint setting. A joint analysis process can include different actors such as humanitarian agencies, representatives of people of concern, representatives from national authorities. The facilitator goes through descriptive and explanatory analysis steps by summarizing, visualizing, and describing the situation. He or she can also draw obvious conclusions, suggest them, and then share preliminary findings with participants. Participants share their comments on the findings in writing, and then the facilitator collates all views, processes them as any other round of commentary, and prepares material for the meeting itself. During the session itself, the facilitator presents preliminary findings and results of individual analysis with the participants and leads the discussion onwards. Now follows what is hopefully a good discussion on the meaning of the data, what should be prioritised and why, ending up in, as far as possible, with an agreement on key priorities for response. In sudden onset emergencies, where the situation often changes from day to day, we will have to cut corners, and the full process would require too much time. What is most common then is to go straight to step 4 and share the findings in plenary and take the discussion onwards from there. But the rest still applies. A good discussion and an agreement in as far as possible as to what the data means. Conclusion. To conclude, we have now gone over the different steps of analysis and how these can lead to different analytical outputs. Descriptive and explanatory analysis can be done individually and are often found in initial briefing notes and preliminary findings. We need to go beyond that, however, and probe deeper and provide meaning to the matters in hand. We need to be able to guide decision makers as much as possible by giving them our best interpretation we can, while also saying something about how the situation may develop if certain actions are not taken. These processes are best done in a joint analysis setting.